Okay, so you want a history lesson, and what would you like to know about?
Um, that depends. What do you have in store for me?
Well, you were asking about American history and why people say Black Lives Matter, right?
Yes, I was wondering about that.
Okay, so do you have any specific questions?
Um,
Do you know who the first president of America was, the founding father of the country?
uh, I know this. I forgot his
There's a
name.
big city, the capital city of the United States is named after him.
Lincoln? No.
Ooh,
No, Lincoln is going to come into this story, but Lincoln is not the person I'm talking about. So, do you know who the founder, the first president, the father of the country for the United States was?
Wait.
His first name was
wait.
George.
Oh, George Washington.
Yeah, George Washington. And so, what's the capital? What's the capital city of the United States?
Um,
New York.
Don't listen to mommy. It's named after George.
Washington.
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C.
District of Columbia, okay?
Sorry, I've
So-
only been to like New York,
I know.
California.
Yeah,
You get it,
exactly.
right?
So you've never been to Washington, D.C., but hopefully we can go there someday. So George Washington was from the state of Virginia, and he was a planter. Do you know what that means?
Growing
Like
the
he
plant?
plants.
Well, he wasn't actually growing the plants, but you're right. He grew crops, things like...
A farmer,
He was
basically.
basically a farmer, but he didn't actually do the farming himself. Do you know who did the farming
Father?
on his
Parents?
farm?
Like, putting the water in and stuff
Putting
like
the
that.
water, digging up the crops,
So he only
doing
puts-
all the hard work.
He would only put the seeds in.
Well, he would actually just basically, he was the president and he was also a general, so he was basically like the boss, right?
So
Parents?
basically, he just told them what to
his
do.
Wife.
Right.
His wife.
So do you know who actually did the work? Mommy says his wife. That's an interesting observation
I
because
always thought it was a-
oftentimes women do the work, but in this case it was somebody different. Do you know who actually did the work?
Parents?
I'll give you a hint. The reason what we're doing is we're telling the story of why Black Lives Matter.
A black person. Obama.
Not just one, and it wasn't Obama.
Obama.
What?
Obama comes into the story much later. So George Washington had hundreds of slaves, somewhere between 100 and
They were all
300
black?
slaves.
Black people.
That's a good question, actually, Sophie. I think the answer is yes, but some of them would have been part black, part white, or part black, part Indian. And it's possible that he would have tried to make some Indians. When I say Indians, I'm not talking about Indians from India now.
Oh,
I'm
red
talking
Indians.
Indian Dang, and as we say in Thailand, right? The native peoples of the United States, right?
Yeah, they're not actually Indians. They're Texas? No.
Before they used
But
to
most
be,
of them would have been black and African black. You understand what I mean by that? Right?
Yes.
So black is a word that we use to describe many, many people around the world, but in the United States it typically means people who have come from Africa or whose ancestors come from Africa. Do you understand?
Yes.
So in Thai we say kondam,
So
like black people.
So does that mean in America there were supposed to be no black people?
No, what happened was there was this thing called slavery in America. It was, nowadays we call it the Atlantic slave trade, where a bunch of white people went to Africa and
Traded
with
slaves.
guns traded slaves and kidnapped slaves, I think is the better word, right? And put them into boats in very, very inhumane conditions. Do you understand what inhumane means?
Yes, but like before this lockdown, was it still happening?
Well, this is about, I'm talking right now about 350 years ago,
Okay.
right? So
Right now
not
there's
300,
nothing
yeah,
called slaves.
well, right now there are slaves in different parts of the
like-
world, one of which, well, I'm not going to make any jokes about slavery, but one of which lives in your house. But
Hey!
I'm not going to make any jokes about it because
yeah,
it's a
he
very
tried
serious
to point to you to think about it. I
serious
am your slave.
subject.
He's slave.
And There are still people who live in slavery in this world.
Like maids.
Maids who don't get paid. I mean, the main point in
The
slavery
real slavery,
is
they not get paid.
you don't get paid any money. You're the property of the
Belong
the
to the-
owner,
Yeah.
Oh.
and that person owns you, and that
Yeah.
person can. You
Kinda
have
like
no
a-
freedom whatsoever.
Yeah.
Kind of like I own this orange, and I can do whatever I want to this
Yeah.
orange. If I want to smash it, or kill it.
Technically, mom owns that orange.
Well, like I said, but let's not go there.
He going to say he's own me.
Now, slavery is something that most of the world, most of the people in the world now agree was a terrible, terrible thing. But it was certainly a big part of
America?
America before the Americans had something called the Civil War. So what happened was approximately the first 80 years of America, they had slavery. And in particularly, they had slavery in the southern states. In the northern states, they didn't have slavery. Now, what that meant was Africans and others, there were other people too, but it was mostly Africans.
African and Indian and
Even there were even some white slaves, believe it or not, but they were very small in number. There were very few, but Africans mostly, but also Indians that whites had put into slavery, and people who were part African and part white were all made slaves, which meant that they were owned by other people. Now, it's important to point out that not all Africans were slaves. There were some African people or black people who were not slaves. Mostly they lived in the north, but slavery was mostly in the south. Do you understand?
what you call the south of the city, the name of the city of the south you calling it for the most slavery state.
Well, the big cities in the south of the United States are Atlanta, where we just had some big problems with the police murdering a black man,
George Floyd.
and New Orleans, which is the mouth of the Mississippi River, and cities like that. But again, because it was slavery, it was mostly plantation based, which was meant it was these big farmlands. But what happened was the black people said we don't like being slaves, and they started
To fight for
to
their
fight.
freedom.
I think fight is a good word. They started to fight for their freedom, but they also used nonviolent means as well and argued for their freedom. So they both fought for their freedom and argued for their freedom. And they found other people around the world, including some white Americans, who felt like, yeah, slavery is wrong and we should change it, right?
Yeah.
So the black people who, and you're right, there were many cases of black people fighting for freedom, including a famous case of a guy named Nat Turner. And
Isn't that true?
Nat Turner's a guy who was a slave, and he
He's
led
a
what's
black-
called a
black?
slave, a black slave, and he led what was called a slave rebellion. So that's when black people actually killed their white masters and captured their guns and tried to fight for freedom. Now, it didn't end well for Nat Turner or for most of the people because the white people had a lot more guns, right?
And they were outnumbered.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But in the end, what happened in 1861 to 1865 was, I'm not sure about that being outnumbered thing, actually. It depends on where you were. On some of these plantations, the black people seriously outnumbered the white people, but the white people had more guns. And there were a lot of people involved who were whites that did not have slaves. They were sometimes called poor whites, okay? And they were in the middle of this whole thing. Yeah?
What?
There's a lot of black
Wait,
people are middle
wait.
rich.
The poor whites, you don't know. Wait, which side were they on though?
Well, that's an interesting question, and basically they were on the side of the whites. At least that's the way we seem to remember it now. But now, because we've had racism for so long in the United States, we might not have an accurate memory of what actually happened back then.
If you
but
don't-
it's not like every poor white was on the same side. There were some poor whites, John Brown being one of them, who were actually on the side of the slaves and believing that slavery was unchristian in particular and against God, and therefore you should do whatever you can to defeat slavery. And he, although he came later than Nat Turner and he was white, he and his sons who came from the north, actually they were partially from the north and partially from the south, but they led a rebellion against slavery, and also it didn't end well for them. They also got hung up from a tree or killed by the whites who had an army. Remember, the whites in the south had an army. So that's where we're all going, is to this thing
But
called
the
the Civil War.
military. Wait, what was the president doing about this?
Well, that's a good question too, but there were many different presidents between George Washington, who was the first president, and Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th president. And some of them were pro-slavery and some of them were against slavery, but most of them were pro-slavery and doing just about nothing, just sort of hoping that this problem would go away. But of course, the problem wouldn't go away because the black people wanted to be free and the white people wanted to keep them as slaves, or at least the white Southerners did. And there were a whole bunch of other people agitated for many other reasons. And eventually this became such a big problem.
Wait, instead of calling them
So this-
white people, can we call them Trump minions?
No. So
Well, they came before Trump, but basically, you're right. But Trump is the descendant of all those people, the ideological descendant. Trump has the same set of beliefs now that those slave power people had 170 years ago, but you can't really call them the Trump people because they didn't even know Trump existed back then.
I'm not saying like the black people. I'm saying the white
So-
people.
Yeah, I think to
Trumpians.
make it simple, you could just call them the
So-
Trump people. Basically, you're right.
excuse me. So until now, they are free for the black people without having. They free the black people, knowing what's that? Don't have to be the slavery anymore. They get the words from somebody like a big powerful free them already, or
No, I'm
still there.
getting to that. That's 1861 to 1865,
Oh, okay.
the Civil War. Now, in the meantime, England stopped having slavery. And England, in many ways,
Even
was
Thai.
where this all started. Well, the whole Thai thing comes later, and we'll get to
Thai
that.
also we
That comes
release the slavery in Rama 5.
Right.
He released the
That comes later.
slave.
Right.
Okay.
So they had slavery in Thailand as well, but the slavery in Thailand was not really race based.
Like
But
they
the
weren't
slavery
really
in America was race
So,
based.
like,
That's a big difference.
in
if that makes sense.
Thailand. Like there weren't really abusive masters. I would say.
Of course there were. Anywhere there's slavery, there's abusive masters. Okay. Now
Like,
there's
there weren't
good
many.
masters
There's-
and abusive masters and all of that.
Yeah, you have different.
And if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend that you read the books or listening to the recordings of a man named Malcolm X, who explained the whole difference between a good massa and a bad massa and all that kind of stuff. But Thailand is a different story. We can talk about the history of Thailand at some point if you want. But even Rama 5, Rama 4, Rama 5, they came after the American Civil War. So right now we're just telling the story of the American Civil War and how America became the way it is. And they had this huge war where the North and the South fought what's called a civil war, which means that basically everybody in the country was at war against each other. At the time, it was, I think, although
What they're fighting
China
about?
usually, they're fighting about slavery.
Oh.
Although the Southerners still don't want
Like
to
a
believe,
racist-
they were fighting about slavery. That was exactly what they were fighting about. Although the Southerners still don't want to say we were fighting about slavery, they say we were fighting about states' rights or our honor or something. But basically, they were fighting about slavery. Now, and it was a huge war, and at the time, it was, I believe, the bloodiest war that had ever happened in the history of humanity. Now, China also had some very bloody wars, so I might be wrong because in terms of the number of people who died, China usually wins those records. Not
Wait,
something to be proud of, but This was basically the bloodiest war that
was
had ever
this
happened.
Civil War also known as the Cold War?
No, the Cold War comes about 100 years later. Okay? Now, the Civil War was the
The
North
first
against
ever
the South.
war in America?
It wasn't the first ever war, but it was the biggest ever war in America. And it was the North fighting to get rid of slavery and the South fighting to keep slavery. Now, there are different historians who have different interpretations of that war, but I'm telling you that's what it was about. Now, who do you think won?
Since there are not much black people slavery now, that means the black people won.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, and I think you're right, because what happened was for about 3 years there wasn't much progress. Both sides were fighting each other, and then what happened is and both sides were mostly white people. And then what happened was the North said, well, we should let the blacks fight with us too, since the fight after all is about slavery. So once the black people joined the North and started fighting as well, then the North had a bigger advantage and they won the war. And you're right, they got rid of slavery. And getting rid of slavery is called the 13th Amendment. And they passed some laws saying that we can't have slavery anymore. However, who do you think owned the farms where they used to have the slaves?
White.
George.
Yeah, the descendants of George Washington and the same white people that had fought the war to keep slavery. So they still owned the farms. And they still had a lot of power. So then they caused a lot of problems, including something called the Ku Klux Klan. Do you know what that is?
No.
Well, that was just these bunch of white guys that put white hoods on their head and rode around on horses and started hanging black people from the trees.
So bad.
And it was very bad. And they started doing all kinds of terrible things to black people, in particular to black men. Okay? And
They raped
started,
the black woman.
and yeah, all that happened too. But yeah, they definitely did. And it happened a lot more during slavery than after slavery, but it's happened right through the history of America. No doubt about that, not to mention children. But in particular, they started saying that black men were a threat to the peace and safety of the white people in the South. And now they passed a whole bunch of laws that made it illegal to do things like loitering or vagrancy or not have a home or not have a job. So then they started taking a whole bunch of black people and putting them in jail because there was no more slavery anymore, right? So now what happened was all these slaves were free. Now they needed a job. But then what happened was the white people said, let's pass a law. If you don't have a job, we can put you in jail.
Right?
That's what they did.
Okay.
So then, now you have a whole bunch of black people being put in jail and a whole bunch of laws being passed basically to try to oppress the black people and do whatever they want to them. Yes, Sophie, what's your question?
Most jobs require an education, right?
Not necessarily, especially
In the
not
farm,
back
we don't
then,
need that,
because
right?
there's farming and
Yeah.
building things and
Yeah,
all
we don't
kinds of
need
things
that
that
thing.
don't require an education. But it's a great question. I'm glad you mentioned that. And a lot of black people were thinking just like you were.
I thought-
And they started something called historically black colleges. And they started making a lot of colleges and universities where black people can get an education, and they could go to get an education with black teachers. And Daddy used to work at one called Houston Tillotson University, and you can look it up on the internet.
You
And those-
used to work?
I used to be a teacher at a black college.
You were all the way back in.
No, not back in the 1860s.
He's
Thanks for pointing that out. You're right.
1960,
But
100 years
the
later.
school, 100 years later, or
He
more
was
than 100 years
born.
later, 100 years later I was born, but more than 100 years later I became a teacher because those colleges continued and still continue
Hmm.
today. And originally they were meant just for black people, but now they accept anybody. And when I
Yeah,
was
yeah. I
teaching
think
there,
they
we had a
were
lot of
mixing.
Chinese people there.
Yeah.
And Mexicans.
White.
Not so many
Mexican.
whites, but we had a lot of Chinese and Mexicans. So they accepted everybody, right? But historically, they were a black college, and most of the students were black, right? So that's kind of a better way of doing things. We accept everybody, but it's okay that most of the people that want to come to our college is black. But we accept everybody, right? And they also
Even they
accepted a
accept
lot
the
of,
white teacher.
yeah, they accepted a white teacher like me, and they accepted. I think we had a few white students. I can't remember any. I don't think they came to my class, but I think we might have had a couple.
How
I
is
think
your
we had one or two.
experience? How is your experience?
It was great. I
Well,
loved it.
what did you teach?
I taught physics, but I also taught some other things like technical writing, but mainly I taught physics and mathematics.
Did you teach any science?
Yeah, physics is science.
Right.
Now, we're just getting started, really, on the history of the United States, okay?
Dad, it's been 20 minutes.
All right, turn it off. We'll finish some other time.